Hello and welcome to Ask an Archaeologist. I'm Sara Kanza, the host of this afternoon's show. Ask an Archaeologist is a series of live streamed interviews co-hosted by the Archaeological Research Facility and the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology for Cal Week 2020. So each day at 11 and 2 this week, we have interviewed a UC Berkeley archaeologist and are taking audience questions. So this is the last of our series this week. And thank you for tuning in. Before we start today's interview, I want to remind you how you can ask questions. So if you open a browser and go to Slido, which is sli.do, type in Ask ARF, click on Join, and you can type in your question. And we'll also remind you about this partway through the interview. So in today's last episode this week, we're speaking with Sara Ann Knutson. Sara Ann is a fourth-year PhD candidate in anthropology at UC Berkeley. She has a master's degree in archaeology from the University of Cambridge and a BA in history from the University of Michigan. She's lived in 3 foreign countries to conduct archaeological research. And as a visiting scholar at the University of Cologne, Germany, she recently completed research on medieval economic networks and the circulation of ivory between medieval Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and the North Atlantic. She's currently working on a dissertation that examines global socioeconomic networks across Eurasia from the perspective of medieval Arab coins. And so we're very excited to hear about this work today. Thank you for joining us, Sara Ann.
Thank you.
And yeah, I would like to invite you to tell us about your work.
Great. So I'm going to start by sharing the slides, hopefully. Here we go. Okay.
Great.
So I'm going to play it. Hopefully you can see that.
Yep.
All right. I'll start by kind of sharing you an overview of some of the places that my archaeological research has taken me. The top 2 photos that you see here on the slide are from the Eastern Scottish Isles of Shetland and Orkney. This is something I did for my master's thesis at the University of Cambridge. But archaeology has taken me definitely all over the world. I used to live in Sweden, where I conducted research on these monuments called the rune stones, which are from the Viking Age. But I've also done work in the Arctic and as well as the Middle East. So archaeology is great in that it can take you literally all over the world. What I thought I would do today is start by talking about 2 projects that I've been working on throughout my PhD. The first is the one that you mentioned, Sara, about the medieval ivory trade. And this will kind of it'll give you a flavor of the sort of questions I'm asking about the archaeological record. So I'm going to start by just giving you a brief overview of the medieval period. This map is just to show you the kinds of interconnections that are happening between Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And this was something that I started thinking about in terms of the ivory trade. Medieval Europeans really liked carving in ivory, particularly from the ivory of the African savanna elephant. And I'll show you an example of an object that was created from African ivory. This is an object that is on display at the Met in New York. And you can see that African ivory has a very light, very milky color. It's also very soft to carve, which European carvers really liked. But I started noticing that there's all these different objects that are not carved in African ivory. And I will show you some examples here. All the images that I've shown you here are carved out of medieval walrus ivory. Now, walrus comes from very few places in the world. During this time, the walrus ivory was sourced from the Barents Sea region, as well as the North Atlantic. So we're talking Iceland and Greenland. And I started thinking about how these different trajectories of how these materials end up in Europe are connected to wider connections of trade and exchange. Particularly, I was wondering if there's a connection between when African ivory appears in Europe as opposed to when walrus ivory appears in Europe. And so I kind of had that question in my mind, and I thought, well, let's map the network of walrus ivory and see what happens. And this is another example of some walrus ivory objects. These are the famous Lewis chessmen. If you've ever been to the British Museum or the National Museum of Scotland, these are the objects that are on display there, also carved in walrus ivory. But this is the network that I came up with. I collected data from museum collections in over 14 countries, and I collected data on the movement of walrus ivory materials. And I was interested in where they were coming from, particularly in the North Atlantic, as well as where they were ending up across Europe. And so that's kind of giving you a sense of what it looks like. But what happened when I did the time slices of this network is it really brought into play how the African ivory trade is influencing this particular network. So this is the network that what it looks like when the African ivory trade is happening. So again, Europeans prefer African ivory. So we see a little bit of walrus ivory objects on the continent. They're coming mainly from Iceland, but really there's not too many objects happening yet. Now, when we enter the 11th century, for some reason, the African ivory trade collapses. We don't know exactly why. Scholars sort of posit that there's some sort of internal conflict going on in the Fatimid Caliphate, but for whatever reason, the trade between Africa and Europe gets cut off in terms of ivory. So this is what happens when that trade gets cut off. Suddenly we see this influx of walrus ivory objects coming in from the North Atlantic at a scale that's never been seen previously. So you can see how there's a lot more movement coming in from the North Atlantic into Scandinavia, and then it's really being distributed across Europe. And now let's look at what happens when in the 13th and 14th centuries, when the African ivory trade resumes. Ironically, the Crusades of all things opened up more contact between the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. And so this is what happens when the African ivory comes back in. We see the collapse of the walrus ivory network. There's still some connections happening. We still see some movement of objects in the continent, but definitely not at the same scale that we saw previously. So it's a really interesting case study of how developments that are happening in the Middle East and Africa can affect activity that's going on in Greenland and Iceland.
I can just ask a quick question. Now, is this raw materials that are coming in, or is it worked materials, or both?
So I'm including both, and that's a really good question. It's a really good question because previously archaeological studies have focused on raw material, and the worked material that you see often in museum collections, that's usually been relegated to the study of art historians. And there really hasn't been anyone that has sat down and said, wait a minute, these things are part of the same assemblage, really. So that was what kind of helped me create that data set and really helped me to sort of see this at a more macro level. Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Great. So that kind of brings me to my dissertation research now, which is not on ivory, but the same principles sort of apply, especially with what I'm doing with network analysis. So for my dissertation project, I'm looking at the movement of Arab coins from the Arab world as they move across Eurasia, particularly in Eastern Europe. This is a really interesting phenomenon because there are so many coins that, well, first of all, they're being sourced in modern day Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and then they're being minted in the Arab world, and then somehow they end up across Eurasia. And this is the scale that we're talking about. This is the distribution of medieval Arab coins. You can see that they're literally being found all over. There's a particular concentration in Eastern Europe, particularly Eastern Germany, Poland, especially in Russia, most definitely in Sweden, but you find them in England, France, etc. So it's a really interesting phenomenon of how these coins are being traded and why. This is definitely an open question that I'm trying to tease out. This is to give you an example of what a hoard would look like. So these are where we're typically finding these Arab coins. This is the Spillings hoard, which is the most famous one. It was found on the island of Gotland in Sweden. But you can see that really these Northern Europeans and Europeans more broadly are really interested in Arab silver, and they're collecting it in vast quantities. So that's sort of what I'm doing for my project. It's going to be a non-invasive survey. I'm not going to excavate anything. Instead, I'm going to be looking with pre-existing, pre-assembled collections and museums and archives, and looking at what this data from all these coins can tell me, and how can we reconstruct these social economic networks. This is an example of what the museum collection might look like. This is again from the Spillings hoard on Gotland. You can see how the coins are being lined up according to date that they were minted or found. You will notice in this image that there are some coins that have been literally chopped in half. This is a really interesting phenomenon in the medieval period, because the value of the currency was based on its weight, not necessarily on an established value, right? So you can see where this is going. So if you wanted something that was worth half of a coin, you just literally chopped it in half.
Wow.
And this is called hack silver, is that sort of phenomenon of chopping coins in half. So I'm going to stop the share now. So hopefully we're back. I'm going to show you what a replica of these look like. So I don't know if you can see it.
Yep.
I know it's really tiny to see.
No,
So what we do with Arab coins is they're written in Arabic, obviously. So you have to read them from right to left. So what I do is I usually start in the middle of the coin. Again, I can show it more closely. See it? So this inscription reads, La ilaha lil Allah. So there's no God but God. And then it goes on to say that on the other side that Muhammad is the messenger of God. So these are verses taken from the Quran. And again, what you do once you read the middle of the inscription is you go through the edges. Again, you read counterclockwise. And this inscription will tell you things about where the coin was minted. For example, we have a lot of coins that are minted in Damascus or Baghdad. It'll tell you the date that it was minted, and usually the ruler, the caliph that sponsored the minting of these coins. So there's a lot of really valuable information there.
Can you see trends, or are there any patterns in where the coin was minted and where the coins end up around Eastern Europe? Like, do you see concentrations of certain types of mints in certain areas, or is it all over the place?
Yeah, that's going to be a good question. I don't know yet. I don't know. So it's going to depend on what I'm finding in the museum collections. I suspect there's going to be some sort of, temporal element where certain caliphates are being represented in certain regions. But it'll be interesting to see how those patterns play out. Definitely.
Great. I'm just going to pause for 1 sec to remind the listeners about how they can ask a question. If you have a question to ask Sara Ann, you can go to Slido, sli.do, and type in Ask ARF, and then put your question there, and it'll reach her here. I actually have a couple of questions from listeners already, if I may. Someone asks, are you adjusting in your research? Are you accounting for the fact that might be a bias in what we find in museums versus what actually existed in terms of the total volume of coins?
Absolutely. This is very important to keep in mind. Kind of difficult to put into practice, but it's definitely important to realize that the things that end up in museum collections have an inherent bias, right? So silver coins are traditionally something that would be considered valuable, even exotic. So they're going to end up in museum collections more than other kinds of materials. There's that. We also need to account for the fact that I'm almost certain that at least some amount of silver was later melted down, right, for its material. So what we find in these so-called hoards across Eurasia is definitely not, all of the phenomena. So even still, even though we're dealing with pretty big data here, we're still dealing with a fraction of what actually was happening in the medieval period.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And when you, to get your data sets, do you actually go to museums and look at the coins, or is there some research you've done virtually? Are there online databases you can access? How do you go about that?
Yeah, so it's a combination of everything. So some collections are digitized, others are not. So it's a very long process of figuring out which collections actually have these kinds of materials. But I'm also using, whatever previous scholarship has been done on these. Sometimes they will reproduce their data, so I can take a look at that. And some museums are really good about publishing their data online, so I'm able to virtually go through this data and develop my database that way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, and just one more question from before we move on. And a listener has asked, are there geochemical studies of the metal coins that show different minting regions?
Yeah. So this is something I'm a little less familiar with because I'm not a geochemist, but definitely this has been done before. I will say though that it's generally done on a regional scale. There hasn't been research that has really applied this on the macro scale of Eurasia, because that would be a very, very large project. But definitely I will be using some of those studies to help me think about where these materials are coming from. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And someone also has asked, what would they use to cut the coin? It seems like it would be hard to do.
It's a good question. I haven't really thought about it. Yeah. I'm assuming just an axe or whatever they had. I mean, silver is fairly soft, so I'm assuming it wouldn't take that much to sort of hack it in half.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I have some more questions too, unless you had more. Did you have more slides you wanted to get back to, or?
I'm good.
Okay. Well, so why are medieval Arabic coins so available today? They're for sale on places like eBay. Are these fakes? Can you comment on looting and that kind of thing?
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is a very tricky issue. The first thing I guess I should mention is that obviously we have a lot of coins. These things, when we find them across Eurasia, they number in the millions. Yeah,
Wow.
we're talking such big data here. So in Sweden, we have about 70,000 hoards that represent 140 million coins, and that's just Sweden. So
Wow.
we're talking huge amounts of coins, first of all. But to get back to the question about how these things are appearing on eBay, definitely touches on this issue of looting and the illegal antiquities trade. So it's important to point out that there's a lot of problems that impact archaeological sites today. We have urban development and construction, natural disasters, but looting is still considered the most devastating to archaeological sites. And so looting is the major source for artifacts that appear on the antiquities market. So this kind of touches on the issue of where items go after excavation. As archaeologists, we are trained to handle objects, and we're trained to ensure a paper trail once the object leaves the archaeological site. And so when items are looted from archaeological sites, it makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to say anything about the archaeological context surrounding that coin. Like, we truly lose world cultural heritage every time this happens. It's almost impossible. Even if you recover the object, you're not going to recover the archaeological context if once that information is lost. We do have something called the International Council of Museums, ICOM. They do have an online red list database that compiles information about the kinds of cultural materials that are particularly susceptible to looting and the illegal, international smuggling and all these kinds of things. So this database is used to help us sort of think about the artifacts that are being stolen and to try to help return these objects to their owners in the event that these objects are being sold illegally. So I'll go into this issue a little bit if we have time for it.
Yeah, definitely.
So this is where the issue becomes more complicated though. So these efforts are really turning cultural heritage into cultural property. And I mention this because once you start conceptualizing artifacts as property, national property laws come into play. So I'll give you two examples. One is the country of Mexico, which licenses people who find artifacts to possess them, but they do not own them. So it means that they cannot sell the artifact and they cannot give it away, but you can possess them. The US, in contrast, is the only country in the world that has this extreme notion of entirely owning cultural property. So this means that you can do anything with it. If you own a piece of cultural property, you can do anything with it, including destroy it. So it's really important to kind of think about the national property laws that are coming into play here. The other issue is that we don't have an international body that polices or governs the import and export of stolen cultural property. We do have the UNESCO Convention of 1970, but this only applies to countries who are signatories. So there's always going to be these kind of loopholes, right? Now, the US is a signatory of the 1970 UNESCO Convention, and they had to create a law thereafter that sort of kind of brings these things into the legal realm. So we do have a law in the US now that prohibits the import of cultural property from countries that are also signatories of UNESCO. Again, it always applies to who are the signatories. The loophole here is that this law only protects antiquities that are worth at least $5,000. Yeah, so these coins I'm looking at, an individual coin is not going to be worth 5,000, I wouldn't think. So that's going to be another loophole to get through. And this law only applies to antiquities that were brought into the US and any other signatories of UNESCO after 1970. So if you have something that belongs to another country prior to 1970, you are not necessarily required to give it back, which creates all these issues of patriation and so on and so forth. So I'll wrap up, I guess, by saying, to get back to the original question, they may or may not be fakes. They might not be, they might be real. But we need, as if people are going to collect them, and you can collect them, but collectors are really powerful stakeholders in this antiquities trade. And they really need to be engaged in the ways in which that they collect these things. They need to ensure that there's a proper paper trail if you are going to collect them, because there's so many people who are just unaware that these items are on a black market. And that's really kind of what the issue boils down to.
Yeah, and I think specifically, particularly for coins, they're so small and there's so many of them.
Yeah.
I feel like that's something that, at least when I was in Jordan, I remember little kids trying to sell you coins, that they just dug up somewhere, on the site that you were nearby. And it seems like they're so accessible and they're so easy to just put in your pocket. There's a lot of education that has to happen around that.
Definitely.
Very interesting. Yeah. To pivot a little bit to another question is, can you talk a little bit about the oldest form of currency based on what we know archaeologically?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing is that ever since human history, we've had some sort of system of economic exchange, whether it's a bartering system or other kinds of movable wealth. But coins specifically kind of appear in 3 places in the world at around the same time. So they appear in northern China, they appear in the Ganges River Valley in Northeast India, and they also appear in the Aegean Sea Mediterranean area. In each of these areas, coins appear roughly around 600 BC. So if you're not an archaeologist and you want me to put that date into context, this is before the Roman Empire, roughly around the time of Alexander the Great. That's when we see the first evidence of coinage. This comes a lot from the economic anthropologist David Graeber, who's famously wrote his book on debt, which is really interesting. And he has used coinage to talk about what he sees as oscillations and periods in Eurasian history, in which sometimes coinage is used and other times when a system of credit is being used. So based on Eurasian history, he argued that one motivation for creating coinage was for the compensation of soldiers, right? Because it's like you say, it's a movable wealth that you can just put in your pocket. And so empires particularly seem to be drawn to coinage as a monetary system. And at least David Graeber would argue that systems of credit come into play when there's relatively, there's periods of relative social stability and peace, and you need to really have networks of trust in order to really pull that off. So it's interesting to see how these things kind of come and flow in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so again, if you have a question to ask, please go to sli.do and type in Ask Arf and send us a question. I would like to go back to the ivory objects. They were so pretty. I'm assuming that the stuff coming out of Africa is elephant ivory. Is that, can you talk a little bit more about, I mean, are there there's hippo ivory as well, as far as I understand, but I'm assuming a lot of these objects are made out of elephant ivory. You showed that there were workshops around Europe.
Yeah. So the main workshops around this time tend to be in Cologne, Paris, Trondheim. Trondheim is where we believe that the Lewis chessmen were carved. But it's usually going to be in these same centers where trade seems to happen. Not exclusively, but they definitely tend to appear in definitely urban centers. Yeah, but it is true. Like I don't know if any work has been done on hippo ivory, but yeah, the African savanna elephant is like the main source of ivory during this time. Definitely.
And so looking at those chessmen and then looking at that amazing silver hoard that you showed, who decides where the artifacts go after an excavation for safekeeping and preservation? Like where do those things end up and why?
Yeah, so this is a very complicated question. So this kind of goes back to our question of what items tend to be preserved, right? That's kind of like the first question is, what are the biases in museum collections from the start? Traditionally, only items that are considered rare and exotic or somehow valuable tend to find their way into museum collections. But after archaeologists identify which artifacts deserve to be preserved in the first place, the question of where to house them, if not back at the site, is then kind of, what they need to figure out. This depends on a lot of factors, not least where you found the artifact, who found it, what is its deemed value. Again, like different countries will have different laws about these kinds of things, particularly when a member of the general public finds a historical item like this. The US has a number of different laws regarding these things. The US Antiquities Act from 1906 forbids unauthorized excavations on federally owned lands, for example. It's also illegal today in the US to disturb any human remains, but it is legal today to collect artifacts on private property if you have the written consent of the owner. So there's that kind of issue. As for museums, it depends on the institution on how they choose to handle artifact acquisition. Sometimes they'll acquire artifacts through donations. Sometimes they will purchase the item. I think in also some cases, national museums will acquire artifacts from smaller scale museums. So there's a variety of different ways in which artifacts kind of circulate and end up in a museum.
Interesting.
Yeah.
We have a couple of questions now coming in from the listeners. So, so one is about hoards. And when you find a hoard, is it collected in an object or is it like dispersed throughout a site? Like, is it a treasure chest or a package? I guess just defining what does a hoard mean?
Yeah, this came up in my qualifying exam actually, and I'm still thinking about it. What does the term hoard actually mean? Because in every other part of the world, it seems to be, it's called a cache or a deposit. So why do we call them hoards is a really interesting question that I can't answer yet. Yeah, so they don't, as far as I can tell, they don't generally end up in like a treasure chest, but they are not necessarily dispersed around the site either. So they tend to be buried together in a small area within the ground. So for example, the Spillings hoard, which comes from Gotland, Sweden, was found underneath, in the ground underneath a pre-existing structure. So whether it was someone's house or whatever we think that structure was used for, it seems to be that the hoard is a way of, it's kind of like the modern bank. It's a way of storing the silver for safekeeping. Yeah.
That actually leads really nicely to the next question, which was how long did it take for the first banks to appear after coins started becoming more widespread?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I need to do more research on the development of banks. I think it kind of depends on how you define a bank, first of all, right? Whether we can consider these hoards as actual banks or whether there's something else going on is, I think, a question that we need to tease out a little bit. But yeah, it's a good question. I need to think more about it.
Yeah, that's a good one. Well,
yeah.
Okay, and then we have one more question here from the listeners. Did Viking control of the northern ivory sources mean that coins were moving in that direction? Are these related?
So I don't have evidence that these phenomena are related. The trade of ivory, as far as I can tell, doesn't necessarily equate with the exchange of coinage or silver. For example, we know they are right to point out that the Viking Age Scandinavians controlled the North Atlantic. They colonized Greenland during this time. And we have records that the Norwegian kingdom at this time wanted the local Scandinavians on Greenland to pay their taxes in ivory. So there's an interesting way that ivory is being circulated as a form of movable wealth in of itself. So I don't think it's necessarily that you pay money and you get ivory back. It's more about the ways in which ivory itself is a considerable form of wealth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. This is a lot of questions to field, and we appreciate hearing from you and hearing about your awesome research. We look forward to seeing how it develops and reading your publications as they come out about these topics. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I'd like to thank all of our listeners and the people who asked questions. And thank you to those who have joined in this week and during our Cal Week Ask an Archaeologist series. You can see any of these videos. Now they're posted on the ARF YouTube channel, which you can get to by going to bit.ly/askarf. Or just navigating to the ARF website, and you can find our YouTube link to our YouTube channel there. So thank you very much, and everyone have a great weekend.